In a world of construction sites and tight budgets, she was a civil engineer fighting to prove her worth. He, a ruthless construction tycoon, carried the scars of a past that had made him cold and calculating. When a crucial structural issue brought them together, what began as a professional partnership blossomed into a forbidden attraction. But family feuds, buried secrets, and a manufactured scandal threatened to destroy not only her reputation, but also their only chance to build a future together. Get ready for a twist that will test the limits of ambition and prove that the strongest love can be born in chaos. Watch this story to the end. You'll be surprised. If you like love stories, romance, subscribe to this channel, leave your comment. We post videos like this every day. Continuing, the deafening roar of the jackhammer echoed through the construction site as Clara Bennett adjusted her yellow hard hat over her brown hair, pulled back into a simple bun. At 25, she had learned that life offered no handouts, especially for a woman trying to establish herself as a civil engineer in a male-dominated world. Her hands, small but firm, held the blueprints as she walked among the workers, checking every detail of the construction of the residential complex that would be her first major project as the responsible engineer. "Engineer Bennett," shouted Joe, the foreman, waving from afar. "We got a problem with the foundation on Block B," Clara sighed, feeling the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. She had landed the job at Bennett & Sons Construction after much effort, graduating with honors from a state university while working part-time to help with household expenses. Her mother, Mrs. Bennett, was a cleaner at a public hospital, and her father had passed away when she was only 15, leaving the family in financial straits. Every penny saved over the years had been invested in her education, and now she carried the dream of giving a better life to her mother and herself. As Clara headed to the site of the problem across town, on the top floor of a mirrored skyscraper that dominated the New York City skyline, Richard Sterling reviewed the financial reports of his company. At 37, he had built an empire that had started with a small construction company inherited from his father and had grown into Sterling Enterprises, one of the largest developers in the country. His office, decorated with Italian designer furniture and contemporary works of art, reflected the power he wielded over the real estate market. Richard was known for his coldness in negotiations and his ability to transform abandoned lots into billion-dollar developments. His decisions moved millions, and his approval was sought after by the biggest investors in the market. However, behind the facade of success, he carried the scars of a disastrous marriage that had ended 3 years earlier, when he discovered that his ex-wife was cheating on him with his own partner. Since then, he maintained only superficial relationships, distrusting the intentions of any woman who approached him. "Mr. Sterling," said Helen, his secretary, entering the office with a folder of documents. "The reports from Bennett & Sons Construction have arrived. There are some delays in the schedule for the Hope Village project." Richard frowned. That project was strategic to his expansion plans in the east side of the city. He had invested heavily in the partnership with the smaller construction company, betting that the low-income housing development would bring not only profits, but also a more humanized image to his company. "Delays? What kind of delays?" he asked, his voice laced with impatience. "Structural problems, according to the report. The responsible engineer requests an urgent meeting." At that exact moment, on the Hope Village construction site, Clara discovered that the problem was more serious than she had imagined. The soil had different characteristics from those specified in the initial technical report, compromising the stability of the foundations. It would be necessary to redo the entire structural project, which meant significant delays and additional costs that could make the development unfeasible. "Engineer, what do we do?" asked Joe, worried about the future of the workers. Clara took a deep breath, knowing that her decision would affect not only her career, but also the lives of dozens of families who depended on that job. "We're going to stop the work immediately. I can't allow us to continue with an unsafe structure." I'm going to call the office and explain the situation." The call to the Bennett and Sons construction office resulted in an emergency meeting scheduled for the end of the afternoon. Clara knew she would face the fury of her superiors, who would certainly try to minimize the problem to avoid losses. But her professional conscience did not allow compromises with safety. Meanwhile, Richard decided that he would personally visit the construction site that afternoon. It was not his custom to get directly involved in field operations, but something about that project aroused his attention. Perhaps it was the strategic importance of the development, or perhaps the need to distance himself from the suffocating routine of the office. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, two lives that would never cross paths under normal circumstances were about to collide. Clara, nervous but determined, waited in the makeshift meeting room in the administrative container of the site, surrounded by men in expensive suits who saw only numbers and deadlines. Richard, impatient and accustomed to solving problems quickly and efficiently, parked his black BMW in front of the construction gate, preparing for a conversation that would change the course of both of their lives. Fate sometimes chooses the most unlikely moments to unite two people who didn't know they needed each other. Richard strode through the construction gate with firm steps, his Hugo Boss suit contrasting drastically with the dusty environment of the site. The workers momentarily stopped their activities to observe that imposing man with black hair combed back and a penetrating gaze, who clearly did not belong there. His presence exuded authority, and even without knowing him personally, everyone knew that he represented power. "Mr. Sterling," exclaimed Robert Bennett, owner of the construction company, hurrying out of the administrative container. "What an honor to have you here. We weren't expecting your visit." Richard shook the man's hand firmly, but his gaze was already scanning the site, analyzing every detail. "Problems require quick solutions. I want to understand exactly what's going on." Inside the container, Clara felt her stomach churn. She had just explained the gravity of the structural situation for the third time, facing skeptical looks and comments that minimized her technical assessment. Some of those present implied that she was being overly cautious because she was a woman, an observation that infuriated her, but she swallowed it silently, knowing that any explosive reaction would be used against her. "The engineer insists that we need to redo the entire project," said Mark, the site manager, with a tone that made his disagreement clear. "But perhaps it is possible to find a more economical solution." "There is no economical solution to a structural safety problem," Clara retorted, keeping her voice firm despite the tension. "If we build on this compromised foundation, we will be putting lives at risk." It was at that moment that Richard entered the container, followed by Robert. His presence immediately changed the dynamics of the room. The conversation ceased, the postures stiffened, and everyone turned to him with a mixture of reverence and nervousness. Richard's gaze quickly scanned those present until it landed on Clara. For a moment, he hesitated. He expected to find another middle-aged engineer with a thick accent and rumpled clothes, not a young woman of simple beauty, with determined brown eyes and a posture that, despite being clearly tense, showed no submission. There was something about her presence that intrigued him, an authenticity that contrasted with the people he was used to dealing with. "You must be the responsible engineer," Richard said, addressing Clara directly. His voice was deep, controlled, but not hostile. "Clara Bennett," she replied, extending her hand. The handshake was brief, but Clara felt an electric current run through her arm. There was an intensity in his gaze that disconcerted her and, at the same time, challenged her. "Explain the situation to me," Richard asked, completely ignoring the other men in the room. Clara took a deep breath and began to present the technical data, showing the soil reports, structural calculations, and photographs that documented the problem. Her voice gained confidence as she spoke, and Richard realized that, unlike the others, she was not trying to soften the severity of the situation or seek his approval with every sentence. "The cost to correct it will be significant," Clara concluded, but we have no alternative if we want to ensure the safety of future residents. Richard studied the documents in silence, conscious that everyone in the room was awaiting his reaction. He had built his reputation by making quick decisions and most of the time prioritizing profit. But there was something in that woman's determination, in the way she defended her technical position without being intimidated by his presence, that made him reconsider. "How long?" he finally asked. 3 additional months at a minimum, Clara replied, preparing for the explosion that was sure to come, and the cost. Approximately 2 million more in the initial budget. The silence that followed was tense. Richard could feel Robert Bennett's nervousness. He knew that the man was calculating whether his company would survive the financial impact. He could also see that the other engineers present expected him to dismiss Clara's opinion and seek a cheaper solution. "Mr. Sterling," intervened Mark, "perhaps we can find a second technical opinion. The engineer may be being a little too conservative." Richard saw the flash of indignation that passed through Clara's eyes, the way she subtly clenched her fists. It was obvious that she was used to having her competence questioned, and it irritated him in a way he couldn't explain. "Engineer Bennett is the responsible engineer for the project," Richard said, his voice sharp. "If she says there is a safety problem, then there is a safety problem." Clara looked at him in surprise. She did not expect that a businessman known for his financial rigidity would support a decision that would cost millions. "We're going to stop the work immediately," Richard continued. "I want a complete report on my desk in 48 hours, with all the specifications for correcting the problem. And Engineer Bennett," he turned to her, "you will be responsible for personally supervising the entire restructuring process." "But sir," protested Robert, "that means she will have to work directly with our corporate engineering team at headquarters." "Exactly," confirmed Richard, keeping his gaze fixed on Clara. "I expect you on Monday at 8 o'clock in my office. We will discuss the details of this restructuring." Clara felt her heart race. Working directly with Richard Sterling meant entering a world completely different from hers, an environment where she would be even more out of place than she already felt on the construction site. But it also meant a unique opportunity for professional growth. "I'll be there," she replied, trying to sound more confident than she really felt. Richard nodded briefly and headed for the exit, but stopped at the door. "Oh, and engineer? Wear something more appropriate for the corporate environment. Not that there's anything wrong with your clothes," he added quickly, realizing how condescending his words sounded. "But the office has its own unwritten rules." Clara felt a blush rise up her neck. It was obvious that she would not fit into that world of expensive suits and designer shoes. But there was something in the way he spoke, an almost protective tone behind the suggestion, that confused her even more. After Richard left, the room exploded with comments and speculations. Clara, however, remained silent, still processing what had happened. In a matter of minutes, her professional life had taken a completely unexpected turn. On Monday, she would be face to face with the most powerful man she had ever met, and she had only the weekend to prepare for a battle she didn't even know how to fight. Monday arrived faster than Clara expected. In front of the mirror in her small apartment, she adjusted for the 10th time the black blazer she had bought on Saturday with the money she was saving for emergencies. The simple piece, combined with basic dress pants and low shoes that wouldn't hurt her feet, was the most corporate her budget allowed. Her hair was braided to the side, and she had applied a discreet makeup that her neighbor Carla had taught her. The Sterling Enterprises building intimidated her from the moment she stepped onto the polished marble of the ground floor. The uniformed doorman directed her to the executive elevators, and Clara went up to the 32nd floor with her stomach in knots. The secretary, Helen, greeted her with a professional smile and led her down a hallway lined with rich wood paneling to a meeting room adjacent to Richard's office. "Mr. Sterling will be here in a few minutes," Helen informed her. "May I offer you some coffee?" Clara accepted, more to have something to occupy her hands with than out of thirst. When Richard finally entered the room, she stood up automatically, feeling again that magnetic presence that had disturbed her at the construction site. He was wearing a dark grey suit that certainly cost more than her monthly salary, and his hair was perfectly styled. "Engineer Bennett," he greeted, extending his hand. "Punctual, I like that." "Good morning, Mr. Sterling," Clara replied, noticing how small her own voice sounded in that imposing environment. Richard sat at the head of the mahogany table, opening a folder with documents. "I received your preliminary report. Impressive level of detail in such a short time." Clara had spent the entire weekend working on the report, reviewing every calculation, every measurement, every photograph. She wanted to prove that she deserved to be there, that her presence was not just a courtesy. "Thank you. I believe the more information we have, the better our ability to solve the problem." "Our?" Richard raised an eyebrow, a nearly imperceptible smile touching the corner of his mouth. "I like professionals who take ownership of their projects." For the next 2 hours, they discussed technical aspects, schedules, and budgets. Clara discovered that Richard possessed a surprisingly deep knowledge of engineering, asking pertinent questions and suggesting creative solutions. He wasn't just a businessman who signed checks. He genuinely understood the business. "Where did you learn so much about structures?" Clara asked during a break, her curiosity overcoming formality. Richard hesitated for a moment, as if the question had caught him off guard. "My father was a civil engineer before he became a businessman. I grew up on construction sites." His voice carried a note of nostalgia that Clara had not noticed before. "He always said you can't lead what you don't understand. He must be proud of what you've built," Clara commented softly. The silence that followed was charged with tension. Richard fixed his gaze on the documents in front of him, but Clara noticed the tightness in his jaw, the way his shoulders stiffened. "He died when I was 22, he said finally, his voice controlled, but with a hardness that hadn't been there moments before. "An accident on one of our sites. A poorly designed beam gave way." Clara felt her heart clench. "Richard, I'm so sorry." He looked at her then, and for the first time she saw a crack in the armor of confidence he always displayed. "That's why I always prioritize quality over economy, and that's why on Friday, when you refused to compromise safety..." He didn't finish the sentence, but Clara understood. "That's why you supported me," she completed. "That's why I respected you," Richard corrected. "There are very few professionals willing to put principles above convenience." The moment of vulnerability passed quickly, as if Richard had realized he had shared more than he intended. He recomposed himself, returning to the documents, but Clara had seen the man behind the businessman, and that changed everything. "We will need to work together in the coming weeks," Richard said, returning to his professional tone. "I hope you don't mind spending time here at the office. Some aspects of the project will require direct coordination with me." "Of course, no problem," Clara replied, although the prospect of working so close to him made her nervous for reasons she couldn't define. "Helen will arrange a desk for you on the engineering floor. But one thing, Clara," the use of her first name made her look at him attentively. "Here you will find people who will try to discredit you for various reasons. Don't let it affect you. I didn't bring you here out of charity. Why did you bring me then?" The question came out before she could stop herself. Richard studied her for a moment, as if he were deciding how much to reveal. "Because you remind me why I started building. Not to impress boards of directors or appear in business magazines. To create something solid, something that lasts." Clara felt a warmth spread through her chest. There was a sincerity in his words that contrasted with the corporate persona he cultivated. "I won't let you down," she promised. "I know you won't," Richard replied, and there was a certainty in his voice that surprised her. When Clara left the meeting room, she carried not only a new professional responsibility, but also the disturbing feeling that she had glimpsed something deep and painful in Richard Sterling's soul. The man everyone saw as a ruthless business giant carried a wound that had shaped every decision of his adult life. As she waited for the elevator, Clara couldn't stop thinking about the way his voice had cracked when mentioning his father, the momentary vulnerability he had allowed her to see. She had the uneasy feeling that by agreeing to work so closely with him, she was placing herself on dangerous ground where the lines between professional and personal could easily become blurred. What she didn't know was that on the other side of the glass door, Richard watched her silhouette move away, fighting an attraction he hadn't felt in years, and questioning whether he had made a mistake in bringing her so close to his carefully controlled world. The following days established an odd routine for Clara. Every morning, she arrived at the Sterling Enterprises office and headed to the desk that Helen had arranged for her in the engineering department. The environment was elegant but cold, with glass walls and minimalist furniture that made Clara feel like an intruder. The other engineers treated her with professional politeness, but she noticed the curious glances and whispers when they thought she wasn't listening. Richard, in turn, maintained a calculated distance. Their interactions were strictly professional, limited to meetings about the project and technical approvals. Clara began to question whether she had imagined that moment of vulnerability on Monday, when he had shared the story about his father. It was on Thursday that everything changed. Clara was working late, reviewing the structural calculations for the 10th time, when she heard raised voices coming from Richard's office. Most of the employees had already left, and the floor was almost empty. She hesitated, but the voices were getting louder, and one of them was definitely not Richard's. "You're making a mistake, Richard." It was a male voice, rough, full of anger. "2 million thrown away because of the whims of some little engineer who we don't even know where she came from." Clara recognized the voice of Robert Sterling, Richard's cousin and vice president of the company. She had been introduced to him briefly, and the antipathy had been mutual and instantaneous. "They're not whims, Robert. They're safety issues." Richard's voice was controlled, but Clara perceived the underlying tension. "Safety? Or are you letting yourself be carried away by other motivations?" The silence that followed was tense. Clara knew she should leave, but she was paralyzed by curiosity and a growing concern. "Watch what you say." Richard's voice was dangerously low. "Oh, please, do you think no one has noticed? The way you look at her, how you defend her in every meeting. You're repeating yourself, cousin. Remember Melissa? It also started as a professional partnership." Clara felt her blood run cold. Melissa must be Richard's ex-wife. She knew she shouldn't be listening to this, but she couldn't move. "Clara has nothing to do with Melissa," Richard retorted, but his voice had lost some of its conviction. "No? Then why are you willing to lose millions for her? Why did you bring her to work here, on your floor, where you can see her every day?" Clara didn't hear Richard's answer because at that moment, the elevator opened at the end of the hallway. She quickly returned to her desk, pretending to be focused on the documents, when Helen emerged from the elevator carrying a folder. "Clara, still here?" asked the secretary, surprised. "Mr. Sterling asked me to bring these contracts for you to review, but I didn't expect to find you." It was then that they heard the sound of shattering glass coming from Richard's office, followed by a cry of pain. Helen dropped the folder and ran towards the office, with Clara close behind. They found Richard on the floor, a pool of blood forming around his right hand, shards of a crystal glass scattered across the floor. Robert was standing next to the desk, his face red with anger. "What happened?" asked Helen, already grabbing the phone to call for medical help. "It was an accident," Robert said quickly. "Richard accidentally knocked over the glass." But Clara saw the red mark on Richard's wrist, saw how he avoided looking at his cousin, and understood that it had been no accident. "Don't call an ambulance," Richard said, trying to get up. "It's just a cut." "Richard, you're bleeding a lot," protested Clara, kneeling beside him without thinking twice. She grabbed the tissues from Helen's desk and pressed them against the cut. "You need stitches." I said I'm fine, insisted Richard, but his voice was weak, and Clara realized he was paler than he should be. Helen, call my driver, ordered Robert. I'll take him to the hospital. No, Richard said firmly, looking directly at Clara. Clara will take me. Richard, I don't even drive well in the city, protested Clara, but he was already getting up, leaning on her. I trust you more than him at this moment, Richard murmured, low enough for only her to hear. Robert looked visibly annoyed, but said nothing. Helen brought Richard's car keys and a first aid kit, helping Clara to make a temporary bandage. During the drive to the private hospital, Richard remained silent, leaning back in the passenger seat of his Mercedes. Clara, nervous about driving a car that cost more than her house, tried to focus on the traffic. Thank you, Richard said suddenly. For what? For not asking questions, for not pretending you didn't hear the argument. Clara felt her heart race. I overheard by accident. I didn't mean to. I know, Richard looked at her through the rearview mirror. Robert is right about one thing. I shouldn't have brought you to work so close. Why did you bring me then? The question came out more vulnerable than Clara intended. Richard was silent for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, when they were already arriving at the hospital, he said, because for the first time in years, I found someone who reminds me why it's worth doing things right. At the hospital, Clara remained in the waiting room while Richard received 8 stitches on his hand. When he came out with his arm in a sling, she stood up immediately. How are you feeling? Better, thanks for staying. They walked in silence to the car. It was only when they were back in the Mercedes that Richard spoke again. Clara, you need to know that working with me can become complicated. Robert isn't the only one who's going to question our professional partnership. And what do you want me to do? Quit? There was a hint of hurt in her voice. No. Richard turned to look at her directly. I want you to know what you're getting into. My family, my partners, everyone will try to find ways to use you against me. And if they find out that you mean more to me than just a consultant, he didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Clara felt her heart pounding. And do I? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard cupped her face with his good hand, his dark eyes intense in the light of the hospital parking lot. More than I should, more than is safe for either of us. When their lips met, it was with an urgency that spoke of weeks of contained tension. Clara felt like she was falling off a cliff, knowing there was no turning back. The kiss was soft and desperate at the same time, charged with all the unspoken words and all the stolen glances. When they separated, both were breathing heavily. This can't happen, Richard said, but his hand still held Clara's face. I know, she replied, but didn't pull away. If Robert suspects, if my family finds out, I know. Clara repeated. They'll destroy you and me. Clara finally pulled away, the reality of the situation sinking in, as she had fallen in love with the most powerful and unattainable man she had ever met, and it could destroy everything she had built. Then maybe it's best if I resign tomorrow, she said, trying to sound practical despite her broken heart. No. Richard held her hand. I won't let them win, but you need to know that from now on, our every move will be watched, every look, every word. We'll have to be extremely careful. Clara nodded, even knowing that it was already too late for caution. What had begun as a professional partnership had turned into something that could destroy them both, and she was completely lost about how they would navigate such dangerous waters. When they arrived back at the company building, it was past midnight. In the elevator, they maintained a careful distance, but Clara could feel the electric tension between them. As they said goodbye in the parking lot, they were formal, professional, but both knew that everything had irrevocably changed. The following weeks were a delicate and torturous dance for Clara and Richard. During the day, they maintained a facade of impeccable professionalism. Formal meetings, technical discussions, interactions limited to what was strictly necessary. But the furtive glances, the hands that touched accidentally when passing documents, and the moments of loaded silence revealed a tension that grew with each day. Clara became a master at hiding her emotions. She arrived punctually, worked with exemplary efficiency on the Hope Village restructuring project, and maintained cordial but distant conversations with colleagues. However, at night, when she was alone in her modest apartment, she allowed herself to remember each stolen moment. The way Richard looked at her when he thought no one was watching, how his voice softened when they talked about technical aspects, how he always found excuses to prolong their meetings. Richard, in turn, was fighting an internal battle he had never experienced. A man accustomed to absolute control over every area of his life, he found himself completely vulnerable to feelings he couldn't rationalize or suppress. Clara had become a silent obsession. He caught himself looking for excuses to see her, inventing technical issues that required her presence in his office, extending meetings unnecessarily. It was during one of these prolonged meetings on a rainy Friday that the situation almost spiraled out of control. Clara was explaining the latest modifications to the project when a drop of water fell from the office ceiling directly onto her documents. "What?" Richard looked up, seeing a dark stain spreading on the ceiling. "Must be a leak from the floor above." Clara got up quickly to save the papers, but slipped on the water that had accumulated on the marble floor. Richard caught her by the arms, preventing her from falling, and for a moment they were dangerously close, her subtle perfume mixing with the scent of his masculine cologne. "Careful," murmured Richard, his hands still firm on her arms. "Thank you," whispered Clara, looking directly into his dark eyes. The tension was palpable. Richard leaned in slightly, and Clara closed her eyes, anticipating the kiss she had dreamed of for weeks. But the sound of the door opening made them separate abruptly. "Richard, I need to talk to you about—" Robert stopped in the middle of the sentence, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the scene. "Sorry, I didn't know there was a meeting in progress." "We were reviewing the Hope Village project," Richard said quickly, his voice controlled but with a stiffness that Clara recognized as nervousness. "Of course," Robert smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "What dedication, working late on a Friday, alone in the office." Clara felt her blood run cold. There was something in Robert's intonation that made her deeply uncomfortable. "If you'll excuse me," she said, quickly gathering her documents, "I'll get copies of these papers that got wet." After Clara left, Robert closed the door and turned to Richard with an expression that did not bode well. "Interesting working chemistry you two have developed," he commented, sitting down uninvited. "Get to the point, Robert. All right, I hired a private investigator to do a background check on your protégé." Richard felt his muscles tense. "Why would you do that?" "Because someone needs to protect the interests of this company, and I discovered some interesting things." Robert opened a folder he had brought. Clara Bennett, 25 years old, daughter of Rosa Bennett, a cleaner at the city hospital. Father passed away when she was 15, suicide in fact, after accumulating gambling debts. "That has no relevance to her professional ability," Richard said. But his voice had lost some of its firmness. "Oh, but it does to her reputation. And to ours." Robert placed some photographs on the table. "These are photos of the apartment where she lives. Housing project on the east side. Very modest. And these," he placed other photos, "are of her mother working at the hospital." Richard looked at the photographs with growing discomfort. There was something obscene about the way Robert had invaded Clara's privacy, as if her humble origins were a weapon to be used against her. "What are you getting at?" The press would love a story about the powerful Richard Sterling getting involved with a poor little engineer, especially if they found out that she's receiving special treatment, important projects, privileged access to the CEO. Robert smiled coldly. "Corporate Cinderella, how romantic. You wouldn't dare. I wouldn't need to. All it would take is a few photos of you two in compromising situations. A dinner, maybe. Or perhaps you leaving some discreet hotel together. People's imaginations will do the rest." Richard stood up abruptly, but Robert remained unperturbed. Imagine the scandal. Tycoon uses position to seduce humble employee. Abuse of power at Sterling Enterprises. Our corporate reputation would be ruined. And she... Robert paused dramatically. Well, she'd never be able to work as an engineer anywhere again. Who would hire the woman who destroyed one of the biggest companies in the country? What do you want? Asked Richard through clenched teeth. That she be transferred back to Bennett & Sons Construction immediately, and that you keep your distance, professional and personal. And if I refuse? Robert stood up, gathering the photographs. Then on Monday, every financial newspaper in the country will receive a very interesting dossier about favoritism and possible irregularities in the handling of the Hope Village project, with photos. After Robert left, Richard was alone in his office, looking at the city through the panoramic windows. The rain had stopped, but dark clouds still covered the sky, creating an atmosphere that perfectly matched his state of mind. He knew that Robert wasn't bluffing. His cousin had spent years waiting for an opportunity to take control of the company, and now he had the perfect weapon. If the scandal broke, it wouldn't just be his reputation that would suffer. Clara would be shattered professionally and personally. In Clara's apartment that same night, she couldn't stop thinking about the way Robert had looked at her in the office. There was something predatory in that gaze, an unspoken threat that made her uneasy. She called her mother, as she did every Friday, but not even Rosa's loving voice could dispel the feeling that a storm was approaching. "Honey, are you all right? Your voice sounds strange," observed Rosa. "I'm just tired, Mom. Work is demanding." "I'm so glad this new job is working out. I always knew you'd go far." Clara smiled sadly. Her mother had no idea how complicated her situation had become, how she had fallen in love with a man who lived in a world completely different from hers, and how that love could destroy everything they had built together. "Mom, if I ever had to choose between my career and other things, what would you advise me to do, honey? You've worked so hard to get where you are. But remember, you can rebuild a career. The opportunity to be truly happy, that doesn't come along often." After hanging up, Clara sat in her small living room, looking at the diplomas on the wall. Her graduation, the specialization course she had taken on Saturdays, all the certificates that represented years of sacrifice and dedication. Was it worth risking all of that for a love that might be impossible? On Monday, she would have her answer. What she didn't know was that Richard had spent the entire weekend thinking about exactly the same question, and that both were about to discover how far they were willing to go to protect what they felt for each other. Monday arrived loaded with attention that Clara felt the moment she stepped into the office. Helen greeted her with a forced smile, and the colleagues in the engineering department avoided her gaze in a way that couldn't be a coincidence. Something had changed over the weekend, and she knew with a sinking feeling in her stomach that it wouldn't be good. At 9 in the morning, Helen appeared at her desk with a grave expression. "Clara, Mr. Sterling needs to speak with you. Urgent." Richard's office was more formal than usual. He was sitting behind his desk with a rigid posture that she hadn't seen since the first day. Next to him, Robert occupied a chair with a smile that managed to be simultaneously triumphant and condescending. "Please, have a seat," Richard said, his voice cold and professional. Clara obeyed, but immediately realized that something was terribly wrong. Richard wouldn't look her in the eyes, keeping his focus on the documents in front of him. "It has come to our attention that your current situation may be generating conflicts of interest in the development of the Hope Village project," began Richard, each word seeming to tear a piece of his soul. "Conflicts of interest?" Clara tried to keep her voice steady, but a chill began to spread through her chest. It was Robert who answered, opening a folder that Clara immediately recognized as the same one he had brought on Friday. "We discovered some information about your past that was omitted from your resume. Information that, if made public, could compromise the company's reputation. Robert began to place photographs on the table. Clara felt the world collapse when she recognized her mother leaving the hospital in her cleaning uniform, her modest apartment, even photos of her father, which she didn't even know how he had obtained. "I don't see how my family background has any relevance to my professional competence," Clara said, trying to maintain her dignity, but her voice trembled slightly. "Normally it wouldn't," agreed Robert, "but when an employee develops excessive closeness with the CEO, that information becomes relevant." Clara's heart stopped. They knew. "I don't know what you're talking about," she tried to deny. But Robert was already placing more photographs on the table. They were photos of her and Richard on the night they went to the hospital, leaving the building together, him holding her hand in the parking lot, the tense moment in the car. The images, taken from afar and at strategic angles, suggested an intimacy that, even if not completely false, seemed sordid when displayed that way. "These photographs arrived at our news desk this morning," said a voice from the door. Clara turned and saw a middle-aged man with a camera hanging around his neck entering the office. She recognized the type immediately, a paparazzi, a tabloid photographer. "Mr. Andrews, investigative reporter from the City Focus newspaper," introduced the man. "We are preparing a story about abuse of power and favoritism in the corporate world." What an interesting coincidence. An engineer from humble origins who suddenly receives a multi-million-dollar project, works directly with the CEO, has privileged access. "This is ridiculous," protested Clara, rising from her chair. "My work speaks for itself." "I'm sure it does," smiled Andrews. "But our readers will be curious about the methods used to achieve this privileged position." Richard finally raised his eyes, and Clara saw something that devastated her. Shame. Not shame for her, but shame for himself, for the situation, for what he was being forced to do. "Clara," said Richard, his voice low but firm, "for reasons of corporate transparency, I believe it would be best if you return to your duties at Bennett & Sons Construction." "Richard," Clara whispered, unable to believe what she was hearing. "Mr. Sterling," he corrected, avoiding her gaze. "And I believe it would be prudent for us to maintain only professional contact from now on." The words hit Clara like physical blows. She looked around the room. Robert with his victorious smile, the reporter taking notes, Richard with his mask of cold businessman firmly in place. "I understand," said Clara, her voice surprisingly controlled. "I'll gather my things." "Actually," intervened Robert, "it would be better if you left immediately. Helen has already packed your belongings." The final humiliation. They wouldn't even allow her to leave with dignity. Clara stood up, straightening her shoulders. "All right, but before I go, I'd like to say something." She turned to Richard, forcing him to look her in the eyes. "You're making a mistake, Richard. Not with me. I'll survive this. But with yourself. You're letting fear and cowardice destroy the only real thing you've had in years." Richard felt each word like a stab wound, but maintained his impassive expression. "I don't know what you're talking about, Miss Bennett." "Of course you do." Clara picked up her purse, completely ignoring Robert and the reporter. "And when you realize what you've lost, it will be too late." She left the office with her head held high, but the moment the elevator doors closed, she broke down. The tears she had held back for so long finally fell, and she cried silently throughout the ride to the ground floor. Helen waited for her in the lobby with a box containing her personal belongings and a genuinely sorrowful expression. "Clara, I'm so sorry. This isn't fair." "Thank you, Helen, for everything." Clara took the box, noticing that her hands were trembling. Outside the building, Clara found some photographers who began snapping their cameras the moment she appeared. The shouted questions mingled, "Is it true you had an affair with Richard Sterling? How did you get the multi-million-dollar project? Did your family know about your methods?" Clara lowered her head and walked quickly, ignoring the taunts. Only when she got on the subway, away from the cameras and flashes, did she allow herself to completely break. That afternoon, the headlines were already online. Corporate Cinderella, how a cleaner's daughter became a million-dollar engineer. Scandal at Sterling Enterprises, favoritism or love? The fall of the poor princess. Clara read everything on her phone, each word a new humiliation. They had completely twisted her story, painting her as an opportunist who had used her feminine wiles to gain professional advantages. Her competence, her years of study, her dedication, everything was reduced to a sordid cliché. When she got home, she found her mother waiting at the apartment door, with eyes red from crying. "Honey, what's going on? The neighbors showed me the news on the internet." Clara hugged her mother, and both cried together. Rosa didn't completely understand the situation, but she knew that her daughter was suffering, and that was enough to break her heart. "Mom, we're going to have to move. I'll probably have to look for work in another city." "Why, honey? What did you do wrong?" "Nothing, Mom. Absolutely nothing." And that's exactly the problem. Meanwhile, in the Sterling Enterprises office, Richard was alone, looking out the window at the city that seemed to have lost all its colors. Robert's victory had been complete. Clara was out of his life, his reputation was intact, and the company was protected. So why did he feel like he had lost everything? His cell phone rang. It was Helen. "Mr. Sterling, the company's stock is up 3% today." Investors were reassured by the resolution of the situation. Richard hung up without answering. Financial successes had been his measure of value for so long, but now they seemed empty and meaningless. He remembered Clara's words, "When you realize what you've lost, it will be too late." Looking at the city below, Richard Sterling, the man who always got everything he wanted, realized for the first time in his life that there were things that money and power couldn't buy back, and he had just lost the most important one. 3 months had passed since the scandal, and Clara had moved to Stamford, Connecticut, where she got a job at a small engineering firm. The salary was much lower, the work less challenging, but at least she was away from the prying eyes and whispers that followed her in New York City. Her mother had insisted on moving with her, leaving behind her job at the hospital and the neighbors who had become a constant source of embarrassment. Clara tried to rebuild her life, but the nights were the worst. That's when she allowed the anger and sadness to surface, when she wondered how she had been so naive as to believe that a man like Richard Sterling could really care about her. The headlines still appeared occasionally on social media whenever someone wanted an example of female opportunism or corporate scandal. It was on a rainy Thursday that everything began to change. Clara was working late when her cell phone rang. The number was unknown, from New York. "Hello? Clara, it's Helen Santos, Mr. Sterling's secretary." Clara felt her heart race. "Helen, how did you get my number? I need to talk to you, it's urgent. Can you come to New York City on the weekend?" "Helen, I can't. I don't want to get involved with anything related to Richard or the company. Please, Clara, I've discovered things you need to know about what really happened, about the photographs." Clara hesitated. Part of her wanted to hang up and move on, but curiosity and a glimmer of hope that she had been trying to suppress for months spoke louder. "What did you discover?" "I can't talk on the phone. Do you know the Two Hearts Cafe in Greenwich Village? Saturday, 2 in the afternoon?" On Saturday, Clara took the bus to New York City with her heart pounding. She hadn't told her mother where she was going, just said she had an important appointment. The cafe was small and cozy, far from the financial district where she had worked. Helen was already there when she arrived, looking nervous and constantly looking over her shoulder. "Clara, thank you for coming," said Helen, getting up to hug her. "Are you okay? You look thinner." "I'm surviving." "What did you discover, Helen?" Helen opened a folder on the table, looking around to make sure no one was listening. "Remember the reporter who appeared in the office that day? Andrews, from the City Focus newspaper? How could I forget? He wasn't a real reporter. The City Focus newspaper doesn't even exist anymore. It closed 2 years ago." Clara felt her blood run cold. "What do you mean?" "I did my own investigation. I hired a private investigator with my savings." Helen took some photographs from the folder. This man's name is Richard Silver. He's an unemployed actor. Robert paid him to play that role. The photographs showed the fake reporter in other contexts, in a play, in a TV commercial, in a family photo where he smiled genuinely. And the photographs of you too? Continued Helen. They were also staged. I mean, you really went to the hospital, but the photos were taken by a paparazzi that Robert hired. He had been waiting weeks for an opportunity like that. Clara felt the anger growing in her chest. Robert set all of this up? More than that, he also paid to hack the building's security system and get the recordings from the internal cameras. He had material for weeks of blackmail. Helen took more documents from the folder, payment receipts, printed emails, phone records. How did you get all this? Robert made a mistake. He used the corporate account for some of the payments, thinking no one would check. But I have access to all the company's financial statements. Helen smiled bitterly. 22 years working there have given me some privileges. Clara studied the documents, the enormity of what had been done against her becoming clear. Did Richard know about any of this? No. He really believed that you were being investigated by a real reporter. Robert was very convincing. Helen hesitated. Clara, you need to know, Richard isn't doing well. Since you left, he's completely changed. What do you mean? He's practically become a recluse. He goes to the office, but doesn't talk to anyone beyond what's strictly necessary. He's cancelled all social engagements, doesn't accept interviews, barely eats. Robert is worried that he's having some kind of breakdown. Clara tried to ignore the pang of concern she felt. Why are you telling me all of this, Helen? Because it's not fair. Not to you, not to him, and because Helen lowered her voice. Robert is planning something bigger. He wants to remove Richard from the presidency of the company. He's using his emotional instability as justification to call an extraordinary board meeting. And what does that have to do with me? Everything. You're proof that Richard is emotionally unstable, that he makes decisions based on feelings instead of business logic. Robert is using the case of you two as an example of Richard's incompetence to lead the company. Clara was silent, processing the information. She had been used as a pawn in a game much bigger than she had imagined. There's one more thing, said Helen, taking a sealed envelope from her purse. This letter arrived for you at the company last week. Robert ordered it returned to sender, but I intercepted it. Clara immediately recognized the elegant handwriting on the envelope. It was from Richard. With trembling hands, she opened the letter and read, Clara, I know I have no right to write to you, nor to ask for forgiveness for what happened. Every day that passes, I understand better the enormity of my mistake, and not just for having lost you, but for having allowed cowardice to overcome everything I feel. You were right that day. I am a coward. I preferred to sacrifice what we had to protect a reputation that, in the end, is worth nothing without you. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even expect you to answer this letter. But you need to know that you were the only real thing I found in my entire life, and that I would trade everything, the company, the money, the power, for a chance to go back in time and do things right. You deserve much more than I could ever offer. I hope you find the happiness that I was unable to give you. Forever yours, Richard. Clara felt warm tears stream down her face. The letter brought back all the feelings she had tried to bury. The board meeting is next Tuesday, said Helen softly. If Robert gets enough votes, Richard will be removed from the presidency. His whole life will be destroyed, just like yours was. Clara looked at Helen through the tears. What do you want me to do? Fight. You're an engineer, Clara. You know how to build solid things. Help me build a case against Robert. We have the proof that he set everything up. With your help, we can expose the truth. Helen, even if we prove that Robert lied, it won't change what happened. Richard abandoned me when I needed him most. He chose the company over trusting me. He chose to protect you, corrected Helen. Robert convinced him that if he didn't do what he wanted, your reputation would be even more destroyed. Richard thought he was saving you from something worse. Clara was silent, fighting against conflicting emotions. Part of her wanted to let Robert destroy Richard as he had destroyed her, but another part, the part that still loved him despite everything, knew that she couldn't live with that revenge. "If I agree to help," she said finally, "it's not for Richard. It's because Robert needs to pay for what he did, and because no one else should go through what I went through." Helen smiled for the first time since they had met. "So you'll help me?" Clara nodded, still uncertain about what exactly they were planning, but knowing that she couldn't let Robert win. "Yes, but we only have 3 days to put our case together. How are we going to do it?" Helen gave a determined smile. "I have some ideas, and I know someone who can help us, someone that Robert would never suspect." As she left the cafe, Clara felt a mixture of fear and anticipation. She was about to throw herself back into the world she had tried to leave behind. But this time, it wouldn't be as a victim. It would be as a woman determined to expose the truth and perhaps to save the man she had lost because of the lies of others. The war was just beginning. The boardroom of Sterling Enterprises had never witnessed such a tense session. All 15 members of the board were present, including representatives of the main investors, company lawyers, and of course Robert Sterling, who presided over the meeting with an air of barely disguised authority. Richard was sitting at the opposite head of the table, visibly dejected. The last few months had taken their toll. He was thinner, with deep dark circles under his eyes and a pallor that contrasted with his usual impeccable appearance. His clothes were still elegant, but something in his posture betrayed a defeated man. "Gentlemen," began Robert, "I have called this extraordinary meeting due to legitimate concerns about the leadership ability of our current president. The events of recent months have demonstrated a disturbing pattern of decisions based on personal emotions rather than business logic." He activated a projector, showing financial charts and newspaper headlines about the scandal involving Clara. "As you can see, Mr. Richard Sterling's inappropriate involvement with a lower-level employee has resulted in incalculable damage to our corporate reputation. Furthermore, his decision to spend an additional $2 million on the Hope Village project, clearly influenced by this improper relationship." "Excuse me," interrupted a female voice from the door. Everyone turned, surprised, as Clara entered the boardroom. She was wearing a simple but elegant navy blue suit. Her hair was pulled back in a professional bun, and she was carrying a folder of documents. Behind her, Helen held a laptop. Richard stood up instinctively, his face registering a mixture of shock, relief, and something that looked like hope. "Clara, what are you doing here?" "I'm sorry to interrupt," said Clara, addressing Robert directly, "but I believe you are making a decision based on false information." "Ms. Bennett," said Robert, trying to maintain his composure, "this is a private board meeting. You are not authorized to be here." "Actually, she is," said Dr. Almeida, the company's lead attorney, consulting some papers. "As the main party affected by the accusations being discussed, she has a legal right to defend herself." Clara placed her folder on the table and looked directly at Robert. "Board members, my name is Clara Bennett, and I have been defamed, slandered, and turned into a pawn in an elaborate scheme to oust Richard Sterling from the presidency of this company." "That's ridiculous," protested Robert, but Clara perceived the nervousness in his voice. "Is it?" Clara opened her folder and began to distribute documents. "Helen, can you project the receipts, please?" The screen showed a series of payment vouchers, all signed by Robert. "This is the payment made to Richard Silver, the unemployed actor who posed as the fictitious reporter Andrews. This is the payment to the photographer who followed us and took the photos out of context. And this," she pointed to another document, "is the payment to the hacker who broke into the security system to obtain internal recordings." The murmur that spread through the room was audible. Robert had paled visibly. This proves nothing. They could be forged documents." "They could indeed," agreed Clara calmly. "Helen, Helen connected a flash drive to the laptop. Audio recording of the conversation between Robert Sterling and Richard Silver, obtained through Richard's own cell phone, who kept the recording as insurance in case he wasn't paid. Robert's voice echoed through the room. "I want you to pose as an investigative reporter. Here's the script of what you should say. Remember, you're investigating abuse of power and favoritism. This is inadmissible," shouted Robert, standing up abruptly. "No more inadmissible than forging evidence to destroy the lives of innocent people," retorted Clara, her voice firm and controlled. Richard looked at Clara with an expression of growing admiration. This wasn't the shy and insecure woman he had known. This was a warrior, fighting not only for herself, but for him. "There's more," continued Clara. "Helen discovered that Robert has been embezzling funds from the company for 2 years, using shell accounts to finance his personal schemes. Dr. Almeida, you have the reports from the independent audit that we requested." The lawyer examined the documents quickly, his face becoming increasingly serious. "This is extremely serious. If confirmed, we are talking about financial crimes that could result in imprisonment." Robert was clearly desperate. "You don't understand. Richard was putting the company at risk. This emotional involvement, these irrational decisions." "Irrational?" Clara turned to face him. "The decision to spend $2 million to ensure the structural safety of a building that will house entire families. The decision to trust the technical competence of a qualified engineer instead of cutting costs? What part of that is irrational?" She turned to the board. "Gentlemen, Richard Sterling hired me because he saw that I was willing to put safety and professional integrity above financial convenience. He defended me because he recognized competence, not because he was emotionally compromised. The fact that we developed feelings for each other doesn't invalidate my professional ability or his." "But the scandal in the press," began one of the board members. "Was completely fabricated," interrupted Clara. "There was no real scandal. There was a conspiracy to create an artificial scandal with the goal of ousting Richard from the presidency." Richard finally found his voice. "Clara, why are you doing this? After everything that happened, why are you defending me?" Clara looked him directly in the eyes for the first time in months. "Because you were right. That first day, at the construction site. There are very few professionals willing to put principles above convenience. And because," her voice faltered slightly, "because even when you hurt me, even when you chose to push me away, I knew you were trying to protect me. You were wrong, but your intentions were right." The silence in the room was absolute. Robert seemed to have shrunk in his chair, knowing that his game had come to an end. Dr. Almeida cleared his throat. "Considering the evidence presented, I move that this meeting be adjourned immediately and that a criminal investigation be initiated against Robert Sterling for fraud, defamation, and embezzlement." "I second the motion," said another board member. "Approved unanimously," declared the chairman of the board. As Robert was escorted out by security, Richard approached Clara. They stood face to face in the middle of the boardroom, ignoring the board members who were discreetly leaving. "Clara, Richard began, but couldn't finish. "You hurt me, Richard," said Clara softly. "When I needed you to trust me most, you chose to believe their lies. I know, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life." Richard took her hands. "But you need to know that every second since you left has been hell. I couldn't work, I couldn't sleep, I couldn't do anything but think about how I had lost the only thing that really mattered." "And what really mattered?" asked Clara, her voice barely above a whisper. "You. It was always you. From that first day at the construction site, when you refused to compromise your professional integrity for convenience, I knew I'd found something special. Someone special." Clara felt tears forming in her eyes. "Richard, how can I be sure that you won't abandon me again at the first sign of trouble?" Richard released her hands and, to Clara's surprise, knelt before her, right there in the middle of the boardroom. "Because this time, I'm going to do it right from the beginning." He took a small velvet box from his coat pocket. Clara Bennett, you taught me what it is to have principles. You taught me what it is to love someone more than yourself. You taught me that some things are worth more than all the money in the world." Clara covered her mouth with her hands, tears now running freely down her face. "Marry me, not for convenience, not for business, not to resolve scandals. Marry me because I love you and because I want to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of you." Clara looked at the man kneeling before her. Powerful, vulnerable, completely exposed. The man who had hurt her heart, but who had also been a victim of the same lies as her. "Get up," she said softly. Richard obeyed, uncertain about what her answer meant. Clara cupped his face with both hands. "Richard Sterling, you're an idiot." He blinked, confused. "You're an idiot for believing that I wouldn't be strong enough to face any scandal by your side. You're an idiot for thinking that you would protect me by pushing me away. And you're an idiot for thinking that I could stop loving you just because you made a mistake." "Is that a yes?" asked Richard, hope growing in his voice. "That's a yes," confirmed Clara, smiling through her tears. "But with one condition. Anything. Next time someone tries to tear us apart, we face it together. No lies, no misguided protectiveness, no unilateral decisions. Together." "Together," agreed Richard, placing the ring on her finger. When they kissed, it was with the passion of those who had lost everything and recovered more than they had dreamed. It was the kiss of two survivors who had weathered the storm and emerged stronger on the other side. 6 months later, the Hope Village project was inaugurated with a ceremony that celebrated not only the completion of a housing development, but the union of two lives that had found in love the strength to overcome any obstacle. Clara, now Clara Sterling, had become a partner in the company, directing the new Department of Corporate Social Responsibility. Her first initiative was a scholarship program for young people from humble backgrounds who wanted to study engineering. Richard had changed too. The cold and calculating man gave way to a leader who balanced financial success with positive social impact. And every night, when he came home and found Clara working on her projects at the kitchen table, the same simple table from her old apartment, which she had insisted on keeping, he remembered that he had discovered something that no fortune could buy, a love that made him a better person. On the wall of her new office, Clara kept a framed photo, she and Richard at the Hope Village construction site, smiling, surrounded by the families who would move into the safe apartments they had built together. It was a daily reminder that the best buildings are not made only of concrete and steel, but of trust, integrity, and true love. And so, the engineer who refused to compromise her principles and the tycoon who learned that true power comes from vulnerability built together not only buildings, but a life based on the most solid foundation of all, a love that had survived the storm and emerged unbreakable.